Evening folks, welcome back to the channel. So a few weeks ago, or it could have been a few months ago actually at this point, I made a video all about how to use a 35mm SLR film camera, and in that video there was a section about overexposing film, and I posted that as a short and I got some comments and stuff asking a bit more about it. So I thought I'll just make a video separately about that exact thing, overexposing film in your 35mm film camera. So I just wanted to show a few examples and run through why you might want to overexpose film, how to actually do it depending on the camera that you have, and the downsides of doing it or overdoing it. So there's kind of two main reasons, at least that I know of anyway, as to why you might want to overexpose film. The first reason would be that you want that sort of airy film look, the sort of portrait look, as you might have seen it called. That look where the entire image is quite desaturated, there's a lot of pastel colours, the skies are really bright, the shadows aren't really dark at all. Kind of washed out, pastel-y looking film shot. And that's kind of known as the airy look when it comes to film. So if you really like that look, you might want to know how people get it, and it tends to be overexposing the film, or editing it to make it look overexposed. And the other reason is simply that you want to maintain shadow detail in a scene. Maybe you're not after that airy look, you just want to make sure with your exposure that you have enough detail in the shadow areas so you can then maybe adjust things in post how you want, but you don't want to lose detail in those darker areas. So you might overexpose to compensate for the dark shadows, for example. And as we know with film, it does a lot better bringing detail back from bright highlights than it does from really dark, muddy shadows. So some of the photos that you've seen me take may slightly sort of have that almost overexposed look. It's not something that I actually consistently do. In fact, I very rarely ever want to overexpose a scene. I want to expose it properly and get the colours as rich as I can. So I'll show you some photos anyway that sort of fall into that category, and I've probably overexposed a little more than I wanted to, probably by accident because I'm using a light meter on my phone and it can be a little off here and there. It tends to always read on the side of overexposing from what I see, so that's why some of my photos have that look. I tend to add the contrast back in again and sort of darken down my shadows to give a more contrasty look. But yeah, it kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like. Some of those photos that I'm sharing are a medium format just because I do take a lot of medium format photos, but the same thing sort of applies. So there's a couple of different ways that you can overexpose depending on what 35mm camera it is that you actually have. So the first method is if you have a 35mm camera like my Nikon FE here, which has a light meter built in. So I shoot this in aperture priority, which means that I set my aperture and then the light meter judges the scene and I can see inside the viewfinder what shutter speed it thinks I should use to expose the scene. So a camera with a light meter that has auto modes and is able to pick the shutter speed for you. And for cameras like this, you can simply use the exposure compensation dial on the top of your camera here and choose a number above 0. Anything above 0 will be telling the camera to expose by that amount over what it thinks the exposure actually should be. So normally this would be set to 0. If you're in aperture priority, for example, your camera will then meter the scene and choose the exposure settings to expose the scene properly. Let's say a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. If you then adjust this exposure compensation dial to +1, you'll be telling the camera to increase that exposure by 1 stop, so essentially overexposing by 1 stop. The shutter speed the camera is going to use would now change to 1/100th of a second, so a full stop brighter. And if you have a camera like my Nikon FE, you'll be able to see that happening inside the viewfinder. If you adjust the exposure compensation dial to +2, then it would be 1/50th, so 2 full stops brighter and so on. If that's a little confusing to you, I know it might be because the number is actually being split in half instead of doubling. That's because 1/50th of a second means the shutter stays open for twice the amount of time as 1/100th of a second. So a slower shutter speed means the shutter of the camera stays open for a little bit longer. So the more you want to overexpose, the longer the shutter stays open to let more light hit the film. Now, if your camera isn't like my Nikon FE and doesn't have a light meter, then you're going to have to meter it yourself using a phone. I use a light meter app on this thing. It works pretty decently. Like I said, it does lean more towards overexposing from my experience, but that's probably a good thing. Most of you that have learned to expose using light meters and stuff probably already know what I mean by overexposing, and you probably already know how to do it, but I'll explain it anyway. Just before I sort of quickly run through how to do this, I did actually do an in-depth video on how I meter for film photography. I'll put it up in one of the corners here if you want to check it out, where I actually explain in detail the process about metering a scene before you take a film photo. This will be an extremely quick version of that. When using a light meter or a light meter app on your phone, you have to choose an exposure for the scene. To quickly kind of explain that in simple terms, you want to choose the area of the scene which you think is middle grey, so not the highlights and not the shadows. You can do this by either pointing your spot meter at the area that you think is middle grey, or tapping on the light meter app on your phone to get the exposure for that part of the scene. To overexpose the shot, you want to take that middle grey value, whatever that shutter speed is, and let's say half it, and that will increase the exposure by 1 stop. If you half that again, that will be increasing it by 2 stops. But personally, I think unless you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, I don't really see the sense in just overexposing random shots. Unless you're trying to learn what it does, then fire away and you'll see. Obviously, you can edit your film scans after you do this, and overexposing by a stop or so isn't really a big deal. Normally you can just recover that detail in post if you want to, but if you overdo it on the wrong scene or overexpose by a few more stops, you can end up losing colour in the sky, which is a little bit annoying, and if you do it too far, you'll end up losing detail as well, which is just going to mean you end up with probably a worse image. Now, there are times where it can be a good idea. If you think that your camera might underexpose the scene, then adjusting your compensation dial to maybe a stop over might be a good idea. If the shadows are really dark and you think that the camera is going to maybe expose for the highlights and just lose all detail in the shadows, then yeah, maybe adjust that exposure compensation a little bit. It also might be a good idea if you have expired film. I believe every 10 years is supposed to be like a stop more overexposed, something like that. So if you're using expired film, overexpose it a little bit more because it can become less sensitive to light. But yeah, there might be a few other reasons, but I don't know of them currently at this moment why you might want to overexpose your film. Maybe you're doing an exposure test or something, but to me, even though I'm making a video about overexposing your film, I would probably recommend trying to get the exposure right. You'll keep the nice colours in your sky, you'll keep the detail, and if you do it right, you'll also have shadow detail. You can kind of adjust it to give that more sort of airy portrait look if you want in post. It just means you don't risk overexposing things too much and losing detail and maybe ruining your photos a little bit. You probably won't, and your film will probably be fine and your photos will still probably look nice. I just prefer to try and get the nicest colours I can, and I think for me that is exposing the scene properly. Even though my light meter kind of insists that I overexpose a little bit, but what do you do? But yeah, anyway, hopefully this one was helpful in some way or other if you want to overexpose your film or at least learn how to do it. Maybe give this one a thumbs up if it was. Consider subscribing if you want to see more, and as we always say, take it easy. Don't be a stranger. I did try this thing out in a recent video, the Praktica FX2. I like it. Results. Still some work to be done, but you'll see in that video.